Hey guys, today I wanted to welcome back Ammon Bartram from Triplebyte. He's here to talk about all the things you need to know to be able to properly run your software engineering interviews, but completely remotely. I have some great news about remote hiring for you, especially if you were only hiring in San Francisco or New York or LA. The number of people who could work at your company just went up by 10 to 100 times. Let's get into it. Ammon, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for coming back on. Obviously, we wish this could be in person, but these days we can't. Thanks for coming back.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. The fact that we're meeting over Zoom really highlights the topic for today, right? It highlights the fact that running a company and building a team and hiring engineers when all you can do is interact, virtually is a real challenge.
Yeah, and there are teams out there, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of engineering teams out there that are for the first time having to do remote interviews. And you've done so many, 1,000, more than 1,000 yourself, and Triplebyte has done more than 200,000 since the beginning. So I guess given your wealth of knowledge, what would you tell someone who tomorrow is sort of doing their first remote software engineering hiring? I mean, that's pretty scary stuff if you've never done it before.
Right. The goal of an interview is to judge, does this person have the skills to join my company and be productive? And that's true, if the person's coming on site, that's true if you're doing a remote interview. And so going with that mindset, there are some logistical challenges. There are things that are harder when you're interacting remotely. And I'll get into those in a moment. But the fundamental interaction is still the same. And there actually are some benefits, kind of doing that interview process remotely, especially now, right? We're all running our companies remotely. And so what really matters for an employee is, can they use Zoom? Can they communicate well in that environment? And so you're actually probably getting a better read of that, right? Interacting with somebody during a remote interview is probably a better just facsimile of, a better stand-in of what the job is going to be and how you're going to interact with that person going forward.
Are remote interviews more inconsistent? And, how do you control for that?
Yeah, I think inconsistency is, in my opinion, the number one challenge of interviews, right? Your goal is to predict, can this person do the job? To highlight that challenge, I like thinking about, so imagine that you had to go back and take your current team, your current coworkers or boss or employees, people who are really good teammates who do the job well. And imagine that you had to re-interview all those people. Didn't know them, you were do over, get in front of them. And the scary question is, what percentage of again, these excellent coworkers of yours would pass that interview a second time?
It's never all science, but the closer to science it is, the better. That's what a good process looks like.
Well, we have to be able to measure that. So at Triplebyte, we interview thousands of engineers. We've interviewed about 200,000 total, and then we send them to companies, and we get to see how different companies react to the same candidate. A thing that I did actually was go in and just compute. Okay, so to what extent do different interviewers tend to agree about which candidates are strong and which candidates are weak? And I think the mental model we all have is that, there are strong people, there are less strong people, and in an interview you're filtering out. But what we found when we computed that stat, something called the inter-rater reliability across interviewers, was that the amount of agreement there was actually so it's quite low, and it was similar to the amount of agreement that movie reviewers have when deciding which movies are best. And so there is some agreement, right? Everybody loves The Godfather, but there's also a great deal of personal preference and noise and randomness in both cases. And who you hire at your company is just absolutely critical, right? Your team is the people you hire. There's nothing more important, really, for a company of any size. And so the core challenge of interviewing, in my opinion, is trying to find sort of strategies to minimize that noise and just more accurately get a repeatable signal of who has the skills it takes to do a job at your company.
The classic thing that interviewers in software used to do, maybe this was 10 or 15 years ago, certainly when I came out of college, people really loved the brain teaser. It sounds like you shouldn't do that anymore.
They're a great example of one of the sources of noise that's really common in interviews. So you get a person in the room, and you ask them a brain teaser, whatever it is. It's a classic interview question about computing you're at the bottom of a flight of stairs, and you can take either one step or two steps at every point in the stair. And the question is, how many unique paths are there at the top of the flight, a flight of n stairs? You could try to write a program to solve it. It's going to be exponential time. This really is a brain teaser, right? There's a very simple solution. It's the Fibonacci sequence. And if you realize that, solving it is fairly trivial. Whether a given candidate in front of you comes to that insight, right? Comes to that leap of logic to solve the problem. There's some correlation with ability and skill. There certainly is. But there's also just a huge amount of noise. So has the person heard that problem before? Or are they less stressed? Right? Do they have more free cycles in their brain to think creatively? Do they just, as they pick a course of thinking of this problem, do they come to that insight? So a rule of thumb that I highly recommend is avoiding any interview question where you have to worry, has this question been given away to the candidate? Right? So if a candidate, if there's sort of a fact or a hard nugget of knowledge about the problem, where if the candidate has that knowledge, then they'll be able to easily solve the problem. That's a strong sign that this is going to be a less predictive question, because there's going to be this noise, and does the candidate come to the insight? And so an example of a question that doesn't have that aspect is, here's an example, here's description of the game Minesweeper. Can you write via this command line interface, can you write an implementation of Minesweeper to run in a terminal? If the candidate knew in advance that you're going to ask them to write Minesweeper, they could practice. But still, it's still a long series of steps. There's no one little bit of hard logic that they have to get right. And I want to point out that it's not a question having that property of being longer and more continuous. It's not the same as being easier. So if you want to add, you can have problems that have hard. For example, you can ask a candidate to write Minesweeper and then write a Minesweeper solver. It's not an insanely hard problem, but it gets into graph theory and some of the stuff that interviewers might want to assess. But it still has this property of being a process that you can observe, as opposed to like a binary hard question. Did they get it right? Did they get it wrong?
And this is part of the reason why Triplebyte itself is so useful before you even commit to doing a remote interview. If you can have your candidates be run through these normalized questions that are not brain teasers before you even meet, that's winning half the battle. And it sounds like Triplebyte Screen is actually literally that.
I actually want to talk about something that we just built and released a few months ago. It's called Triplebyte Screen. And basically, we've taken our internal evaluation process that we use to pre-screen candidates for all of our big customers who I can't name. And we've released this as a product that anybody can use to screen their own applicants. We did a beta with Flexport, and what they did was take their inbound applicant flow, people who were applying directly to them, and previously they were doing resume screens. So they would say, of this cohort, who's worked at a company that looks exciting, who's gone to a good school, and there's some value to that screening, but it ends up screening out a lot of people, especially sometimes more diverse candidates who might come from a non-traditional background. And so what Screen basically is a completely background blind test that Flexport is now using to actually measure the programming ability of everybody who applies in a pretty lightweight way. It's not very onerous for the candidates, and use that actual skills data as opposed to resume screens to decide who comes on site and ultimately who they hire. It's actually completely free. So I think we're going to put a link, if we can, below, Gary, in the show notes. Completely free for companies to sign up.
So it sounds like really, really helpful in this time of remote only interviewing, which is really stressful, honestly, for a lot of people, because they're sort of doing that whole process remotely, sometimes for the first time. Triplebyte Screen is basically going to let anyone get the world's best candidate screening right at the beginning of the process. And that helps incredibly when it comes to the later stage, which is once you're actually bringing them on Zoom for the remote interview, what you used to call the on-site. Better inputs equals way better outputs.
What we're seeing is that as companies go remote and start to hire, not just in San Francisco or Austin, wherever their previous home base was, it's awesome, and it opens up this whole new massive, really the whole country or the whole world, depending on how whether you're hiring internationally, but it opens up 10x the pool of candidates for the role. And we're releasing Screen really to help folks with that challenge. Okay, suddenly you have 10 times as many people who can potentially are good fits for your role. How do you decide? No one can interview everybody, right? So how do you decide of all those people who you're going to go forward with? And the previous best state of the art for that was resume screens, and they do work to a certain extent. They're not non-predictive, but especially if you're not super familiar with the employers in St. Louis where somebody might have worked in the past. It's hard to know if somebody's 3 years of experience at company X in St. Louis is relevant to you or completely irrelevant. And so Screen is a kind of way to get some more concrete data to help with that process.
Yeah, and concrete data is really what this is about, right? Everyone wants to work in tech. And one of the things we talked about at length in our last interview was this idea that credentialism is actually holding back hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people from being welcomed with open arms into technology. Technology is remaking all of society. And it's a mistake for tech companies to not be as inclusive as possible. And what that requires is actually a lowered reliance on, did this person go to Stanford or Harvard or what, did this person win like a lottery when they were 18 years old? And like, should we allow that to determine the course of their whole life? The answer is absolutely not. And that's why I think working with you and Triplebyte is a very important thing to do, and a very important thing to do for all of tech. It really sort of unlocks a key to making it someplace that anyone can enter without regard to what does that resume look like. It's actually about skills. I really, really think that that's powerful.
I wholeheartedly agree. That's our mission, right? Our mission is to create a more just tech industry by fixing software engineering and creating a world where it's the skills that every engineer has that open doors for them. These other things, the socioeconomic class and could someone's parents send them to a good school. One interesting note here actually is that this move to remote and this move to remote interviewing, I think is actually a pretty big positive for diversity. There's obviously the angle of people who don't live in New York or San Francisco are now can now get jobs at at Twitter, at Dropbox, at all these companies that are committing to long-term remote. So that it just expands the pool of people from more diverse backgrounds. But the interview itself, when you talk to engineers about interviews, what they hate is the stress, right? It's fundamentally stressful. You get in front of this person that you know they're judging you, and everybody is negatively impacted by that, right? If you could solve a problem in 10 minutes when you're stress-free, it's going to take you 15 or 20 or 30 when you know that an interviewer is staring down the back of your neck. And this is especially true for people who might have some self-doubt, or maybe who need some accommodations that are hard to get in an interview. And everybody running interviews remotely, it means that every candidate is, they can interview from their bedroom. They can interview from whatever is the most comfortable place for them. They get their own machine with their perfect configuration on it. That not only gets a more accurate measure of skill, people are just, it just opens up the door to all kinds of candidates who might not have been able to interview in the previous model.
So switching gears a bit, I guess not only is remote interviewing harder, also remote closing is even harder. How do you think about that? What can you do in the interview to up your close rate?
There are some real challenges. And I guess I would list two main challenges with remote interviewing. The first is closing the candidate, right? How do you provide a positive experience? How do you show the candidate your culture and your team and the energy and make that person want to join your company after you hopefully make them an offer? Big advice there. First point is just be sure to treat remote interviews as interviews. It's on your it's Zoom session. It's on your calendar. People can forget that it's every bit as serious and every bit as important as a regular on-site interview. And so what are some kind of things that follow on from that? Well, one, 100% don't multitask. So it can be very tempting if you're sitting there 30 minutes watching somebody program, they're struggling with a programming problem. It can be very tempting to open Slack or open Zoom, like they can't see your screen. And maybe they can't, but you got to just hardcore not do that, right? Being present and actively listening, right? Making it clear that you are with them there and rooting for them and reacting when they run their code and it passes the test. Say like, great, Just make it clear that you're actively listening and are taking part. That's when a candidate is physically present, they can deduce, they can read your body signal and they can tell that you're present. It's important to work hard to provide a similar experience in a remote interview. A few other related tips. We find that the junctions between interviewers can be pretty stressful for candidates. So, I interview the candidate and then it's my coworker, Sarah, she's interviewing next. Maybe she's running 5 minutes late, I leave, and then the candidate is just stuck there sitting on a Zoom call by themselves. And that's a really bad experience. And so I highly recommend kind of simulating the handoff. Stay with the candidate, Slack the next interviewer, and then stay on that call until the next interviewer arrives and do a friendly handoff to the next candidate. And that makes sure that nobody falls through the cracks.
That's awesome. Very humane process. Matters a lot, actually. It's the little things that show the culture of how people treat people actually at a given company.
Well, that gets at what I would say maybe is the second real challenge, which is judging, right? So there's both how do you provide a positive experience for the candidate, and then there's also how do you as an interviewer, how do you judge the non-technical skills, culture fit, communication, positivity, all these things that are up there with importance with technical skill in candidates, and they tend to rely a bit more on face-to-face interaction. So how do you, as let's say you're a recruiter, your job is to measure culture fit or culture add. How do you do that over a Zoom session? So if a company is running remotely for now under COVID and is planning to go back to fully co-located in person, then this is hard because you are fundamentally in that you're trying to judge what's it going to be like to be in a room with this person. But for companies that are planning to stay partially or fully remote, what I would say is I think we need to acknowledge that Zoom skill and online communication actually is the skill that matters now. And so what I would say is don't get caught up in whether you can reproduce the exact read on soft skills that you would have done in person. And the set of people who do well might be a bit different. So the skill of communicating really well in writing and being super responsive to a remote team is vital and is not the same as the skill of we all have to learn new skills as we're running remotely. As a recruiter, embrace the fact that you're not measuring the same skill anymore.
The only other thing that I think was interesting is actually now it sounds like things have swung a little bit more towards the company again, which is not the norm. It's been sort of a candidates market for many years. How do you think about that now? Any closing thoughts around what's the opportunity for companies at this time around like hiring? Should they inflect in? Should they be more aggressive than they normally are? Like what sort of advice do you have for people when they sort of control a knob here? They can turn it up, they can turn it down.
Enjoy it while it lasts. It's shifting a bit back to the candidates now over the last few months, but we're still close to the best market as a hiring manager, as a company, the best market for talent that we've had in the last 10 years. It is easier to find skilled engineers who want to join your company right now than it's been in 10 years. And obviously, that's true for a lot of tragic reasons. A lot of companies are failing, and there's a dark side to that. But what I would say is if your company is doing well, if you recently raised money, if you're in business that's really helping a lot and doing well during the pandemic, take advantage of it. Hire those super senior engineers. Like you're going to get a caliber of talent coming, even just knocking on your door. That's where Screen again comes in, right? So Screen is our tool to help you distinguish, right? Companies receive hundreds and hundreds of inbound applicants, especially in an environment like this. And it can be really hard to go through them and tell, like most are not very qualified. That's just the
and if you just use credentials, you might just end up interviewing people with fancy resumes who can actually code accidentally.
Yeah. And even if they can, they're going to be the most competitive people, right? If you're going to find them, so is everybody else. And so using something like Screen to really directly measure the skills is a way to take advantage of this market and the fact that highly talented people are just going to knock on your door right now in a way that is not the case during normal times.
So I guess if people want to take advantage of Triplebyte Screen, what's the best way to do that right now? Just go to triplebyte.com/screen and sign up, get a demo. Cool.
Yes. Triplebyte.com/screen. They'll take you to the right place. I'm also happy to answer questions. If you email me, just my first name, Ammon, Ammon @triplebyte.com. I'm happy to answer questions and help get people set up.
that you've been always super generous with your time, advice, and help. And thank you for working on Triplebyte, because it's really put so many people into the opportunities that they've really worked hard to deserve. Always excited to be an investor and a friend of the company.
Well, thank you, Garry. I really appreciate the support, and I'm yeah, it's an honor to be on your YouTube channel.
Thanks, man.